Hey art nerds! Today's pattern and texture tutorial is going to be for doing wood grain. And wood grain is something that's very easy to do. People tend to overthink it, but you can go complicated or you can go very, very basic. I'm going to start by just applying some yellow ochre to my paper. And I am using the Magello Mission Gold set. Maybe add a little bit of darker color here and there. And this is going to be kind of our base. I'll go ahead and set up a few other swatches as well. And this is another one of those subjects that really benefits from, just kind of observing from your regular life, things that happen to have a wood grain pattern. And referencing things off of the internet and just kind of practicing from there. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind with wood grain, and they're not always true, but they can be used as kind of guides. The majority of the wood, the background of the wood, is usually lighter than the grain itself, unless the wood's been stained, and then they tend to be kind of the same, around the same color. And again, that's not always 110% true. There are some stains that preserve the original color of the wood. And there are some stains that will also kind of bring out the grain. Also, that base color is often not really uniformly colored. So there may be areas that are darker or lighter. So if you get some cauliflowering or blooming, I wouldn't really be concerned about that, since any sort of change to the paper just sort of adds to the authenticity, adds a little bit of extra texture without you having to do too much extra work. So I have 4 swatches that we're going to use as the basis for our wood grain. And wood grain tends to have kind of sinuous movements. So almost like water ripples. You can also get burls in the wood, which is where the wood's kind of contorted and knotted onto itself. And the grain itself often will go from thick to thin, and will sometimes be a little bit darker in intensity or color, and sometimes it'll be a little bit lighter. For my comic, 7-inch Kara, I end up painting wood grain pretty frequently. Since Kara is a miniature person in a human-sized world, this sort of texture can really help denote scale. And it adds just a little bit of extra flavor to the world without adding a lot of extra work. So I'm going to let all of these dry, and then I'll demonstrate various types of wood grain on our 4 different surfaces. Alright, so these have had a chance to dry. These down here are still a little wet. That's the way of the world. I'm going to turn my paper just to make it a little bit easier for me to use, and demonstrate just a few different ways you can do really easy wood grain textures. helps to vary your brush pressure and the types of strokes you make. You can also go in, either wet into wet or wet over dry, and add some darker areas if you wish. You can also create kind of a central focal knot and then work your way around that. And kind of vary how close you put your lines. Since this is an organic thing, you don't want it to look like something that might be mechanically produced. If you are kind of viewing it from a more zoomed out view, or depending on how the wood was cut, you might see it like this. And this is kind of a big brush for this, but it allows me to get some of that line variation. You can always go back in and rework it a little bit if you wish. But for these sort of textures, simplicity is often key, especially if you're using it in kind of a storytelling setting. So if you're using it in like a comic or an illustration, you want just enough of the detail so that people can kind of get an idea of scale, get an idea of setting and world building if that's relevant, but not so much that it detracts from the story itself. You may also find that using a liner or a rigger is a little bit easier than using a round for this. You can also do this using a flat, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So using a flat brush like this one here can make doing things like wood grain even easier and cover a larger area. So we got, actually I want a fresh piece of paper. Alright, we've got our flat all loaded up. Even a little bit of dry brushing like we're getting there can be really good, and you can even use the dry brushing effect like this to do your grain later on. You can also wash it out a little bit. I'll go ahead and get another one started. And even a quick third, because I do want to talk about wet into wet wood grain options. So you really have a lot of options when painting natural textures like wood grains. You can do a lot of different things and you can have fun with it. It doesn't have to be something you stress out about. The only way to kind of ruin it is just to overwork it. So we've got a both very wet and very dry piece right here. You can see in the middle there where it's already dried. So I'm using the tip, sort of the heel of the brush, to just sketch in some wood grain wet into wet. And as you guys can see, it's kind of diffusing out. I'm going to give all of these a chance to dry now. So this one is mostly dry. Go ahead and get started on that. So you can use your flat this way and just vary the pressure a little bit in order to sort of sketch in wood grain textures. So you can do this really quickly. And then we'll go into our wet into wet, which is now dried. You can tighten it up a little bit. So you have a lot of options for doing wood grain. You can do numerous little kind of cross hatches to build up your overall shape. You can do kind of sinuous forms. You can even just do here and there a few little lines to sort of imply. And we did talk about doing dry brush for our wood grain. And that tends to work best with a flat. And this is just sort of a generic wood grain tutorial too. Different woods have different types of grains, different burls. Like rosewood, for example, is typically sold as a burl wood for decorative purposes. So if you want to paint something specific, or if you're painting something region specific or class specific, again like rosewood, then you would definitely want to kind of research that if you're trying to convey that specific thing. And because I always seem to need more examples than I actually paint, generate a couple extra ones down here. So these have fully dried. I'm going to grab a little bit of dark brown and then try to get as much out of the brush as I can without it just being completely gone. Unfortunately, it's still too wet. Let's get the rest of that out. Because what I want this to do is the same sort of speckled skipping that I got up there. And I bet if I did it with the flat side, we'll try that down here. Didn't want to have to pull out a paper towel. Alright, I squeegeed a bunch of the water out. Let's try this again. This is why I did multiple examples. So you see, just this like this, where the bristles are kind of splayed out and it's very dry, already gives you a really nice wood grain texture without having to really do a whole lot of work for it. Dry brush has never really been my strong suit though, so it's something I still continue to struggle with. But for those of you who have mastered the art of dry brush in your inking, this should be pretty easy for you. You can also kind of separate the bristles by hand and just keep doing that. The problem I'm having is getting it so that there's enough pigment on the brush. There we go. Enough pigment on the brush that we can actually get some dry brush going, but not so much that we're just painting over what we just did. You can also go back into the dry brush and add a little bit of variation, like a knot hole here and there. But this would be good for like really pulled out wood grain textures. Even with this, where it looks really dark, we can go in with an even darker brown. Kind of tighten that up. And maybe using like a hake brush, which is like a goat hair larger brush, and kind of doing a dry brush with that, or using a fan brush would be a little bit easier, and that way you would get less consistent results, which would look a little bit more natural. Alright, so I have shown you guys multiple methods today for how to do a wood grain texture. This can be useful for painting the interiors of homes, the exteriors of homes, for painting furniture or stumps or all sorts of things. Let your imagination just be your guide and use this to add texture and help build your world. If you are looking for more texture tutorials, I have a few more here on this channel. They're all just sort of basic introductions to painting textures because I want you guys to go out and study from life, study from the internet, and study from reference. The more you practice from reference, the more you practice from life, the better you're going to be, even if you're painting in an illustrative way or if you're painting comics, so less realistic. You can still benefit a lot from cartooning from real life. So thank you guys so much for watching this. I hope you guys will check out some of my other watercolor tutorials here on the channel and over at natosoup.blogspot.com. And if you enjoy watercolor, I highly recommend you read my watercolor comics, 7-Inch Kara, at 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com. As always, it was a pleasure to see you guys, and I hope to see you again really soon with another tutorial. Bye!